All right, it's the System Failure Podcast, number 86. How are you doing today, Nate?
I'm doing pretty good, Brian. It is a rainy Saturday here in Maine, but Brian, you vouchsafed a revelation unto me before the podcast that talking about the weather at the top of the pod drives you crazy. So we're not going to talk any more about the rainstorm going on outside. We're just going to cut right to the chase. How's that sound?
We do have a lot of topics to talk about today, huh?
Yes, I dare say we got a barn burner for the System Failure audience today, Brian. You know, one never quite knows how these pods are going to go at the outset, but my anticipation level is high, and so should the anticipation levels of the intrepid System Failure audience.
All right, well, hopefully we can deliver on that, huh?
Yes, that's quite a promise. Usually you're supposed to under-promise and over-deliver, so I'm going to over-promise at the start of the pod. That's just a great way to set the tone, eh?
Yes.
Well, it has been a pretty, the stock markets seem to be returning somewhat to a state of normal equilibrium. The VIX is dropping. The yield on the 10-year T-note is stabilizing. So there's not like there's roiling financial markets to talk about at the top of this week. But we did have the death of the Pope over in Rome that happened this week. So the conclave is going to be happening soon. I think that's 5 to 10 days after the Pope's death. They do the conclave, and conclave, of course, means with key, right? Clave is the I think it's the Italian word for key, and so like they used to call a piano a clavier, so because it works the key. So under lock and key, the College of Cardinals will convene and choose a new pope this week, I guess, and so they'll be doing the fun smoke out of the Sistine Chapel, So anyway, that's interesting to me. I guess maybe it's only interesting to me because I just am obsessed with the Vatican and its history, and I did have a chance to walk through the Sistine Chapel and admire Michelangelo's handiwork on the walls and ceilings. So I guess if I can kind of locate myself there, it kind of connects me to the proceedings. So that's why I'm interested at any rate.
Well, it's like the black smoke means they're still deciding, and the white smoke means they've decided.
Yeah.
It wasn't there like some kind of coup at one of these, like where they put out some white smoke, but then they took it back?
I'm not sure. You might be thinking of Pope Benedict, who is the predecessor to Pope Francis, who was only Pope for a couple years, kind of went in and then left a very short time thereafter. I think it may have had something to do with his participation in the Hitler Youth during the 30s back in Germany. I'm not really sure. I can't quite remember, but that's an interesting question. We should look that up.
Well, I think there's been some conclave drama in the past, but anyway, yes. Well, we can replace the Pope with a new child molester.
Look, I like the Catholic Church. I like their ceremonies. I like the Latin flair that Catholicism embodies versus the watery beer and thin rule of Calvinist Protestantism that is what is the tradition here in New England. But I mean, they did do a lot of hiding of child molesters, so I feel like jokes are fair to make on the Catholic Church on that front.
Well, we went to that church. We probably talked about it before, but I loved all the psychedelic imagery and the neon colors on the ceiling. But man, the sermon was really boring, and the choir boys, or the boys assisting the Pope, it made me uncomfortable.
You feel bad if you're like, oh boy, those boys are in danger.
Altar boys, that's what you call them.
Yeah, one feels bad for the altar boys. Well, I still enjoyed this particular service to which you refer. Even with all the shortcomings of the Catholic Church, I still think there's some value to be had in them. This old, the old tradition, supposedly the direct lineage back to St. Peter and whatever. I don't know. I still like it and find it somewhat interesting. But yeah, the Catholic Church, obviously, rife with institutional problems.
Well, it could be awesome. Like, we have such a need for this whole community thing, and if the churches would, or the priest or whatever would just really go up there and let it rip, some fire and brimstone, or just say something intelligent. It could be awesome, right?
Yeah. Yes, the fire and brimstone to which you referred is kind of the flair that I was talking about earlier. It lends a sense of drama to the proceedings. So I do want a little bit of fire and brimstone. And that is fully part of the Calvinist New England tradition. I think of famous, firebrand preachers like Cotton Mather making the rounds in the late 17th century, trying to shame his congregation into compliance with God's word, I wish there was a little bit more of that. The too much shame and guilt, not very healthy, but a little bit of shame and guilt is like seasoning for the stew, you know?
Well, honestly, it doesn't like have to be fire and brimstone. I don't know. I mean, I like listening to Jordan Peterson talk about the Bible and like what these stories like actually mean in some way.
Oh, he's brilliant. Yeah, it's awesome.
So I mean, that would be cool. But yeah, all right. Well, what else is going on? What are we trying to get into here?
Well, just a little programming note. We're going to be hearing Dr. Jordan B. Peterson's Kermit the Frog-esque voice in a little bit. During the second half, we've clipped up his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. So that'll be good. But before we dive into all of that, I had been reading news articles during this section of the podcast, but I was unsatisfied with the prose of the Wall Street Journal. And so I thought maybe instead what I would do is read some exciting quotes from This Week in Will and Ariel Durant's This Week in Will and Ariel Durant's The Age of Faith, which is their medieval book. So for those who don't know, Will Durant is recognized as this great historian, and during the middle part of the 20th century, he and his beloved wife, Ariel, traveled the world and cobbled together this 11-volume series called The Story of Civilization. And the prose is outstanding. Like, it is poetic, as poetic as prose can be. And now, the histories themselves are a little bit outdated. There's been some archaeology since then, so when one reads the words of Will and Ariel Durant, one must keep in mind we're looking at a little bit dated history here, but the prose is just worth it.
Well, I know you're big fans of these people, and I have to say I've never deigned to crack one of their books, so I'm excited to hear what it is you're into here.
Yeah, okay, well, buckle your seatbelt then. I think I've got 4 quotes for today, I think, so in this... obviously, the Age of Faith is like from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, like history of Europe. And so we're talking about Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, named after Alexandria the Great, and it sits there on the Nile Delta, where the Nile empties into the Mediterranean. And for centuries, it was this major port, a big thriving city, and the center for all kinds of bizarre philosophies and like Neoplatonism and early Christians and Gnostics, all yogis, from India, all mixing together to create this milieu of religious and philosophical experimentation in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, you know as well as I, Brian, that eventually Christianity went from being the persecuted, hippie, rebellious, upstart to like the state religion of Rome itself. And so obviously there had to be a crackdown on the Alexandrians, which is the part we haven't gotten to yet. But this is just a little bit about the magical, the tradition of magic as it existed in Alexandria. So let's start with that one. Now this again is from Will and Ariel Durant, The Age of Faith. This book was published in 1950, and the quote I'm reading you comes from page 122. And I won't read all the page numbers. These are all like page 119 to 126. That's where we're at here. So this is Will and Ariel Durant. Again, they're describing the magic scene in Alexandria during the late Roman Empire. Chemistry and alchemy went hand in hand with Alexandria as their center. The alchemists were generally sincere investigators. They employed experimental methods more faithfully than any other scientists of antiquity. They substantially advanced the chemistry of metals and alloys, and we cannot be sure that the future will not justify their aims. That's good stuff. Astrology, too, had an honest base. Nearly everybody took it for granted that the stars, as well as the sun and the moon, affected terrestrial events. But upon these foundations, quackery raised a weird ziggurat of magic, divination, and planetary abracadabra. Horoscopes were even more fashionable in medieval cities than in New York or Paris today. St. Augustine tells of 2 friends who noted carefully the positions of the constellations at the birth of their domestic animals. Much of the nonsense of Greek astrology and alchemy was part of Islam's Greek heritage. Pretty good stuff. That's the end of the quote there. We're going to be talking a lot more about science in the second half of this podcast today. So just noting that, noting the way that the histories of science and alchemy, or of astrology and astronomy, are intertwined, especially in 2nd and 3rd century Alexandria, is very interesting. And another interesting note here is that the Corpus Hermeticum, that famous book of magic, that comes from this era of Alexandrian history. It was a big mistake during the Renaissance. They thought that book was ancient as like Moses. Like they were thinking that Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical figure who is the center of the Corpus Hermeticum, they thought this guy was like concurrent with Moses, and thought the book was much more ancient. It was only in the later Renaissance that philologists discovered that, oh no, based on the words in this book, we can tell that it came from like 2nd or 3rd century Roman Empire, and not from much older.
Well, I like the images it conjures up of a bustling medieval. It's not like medieval. Like when you think medieval, you think of some I don't know, like serfs working in the fields, but like some like the peak of civilization in some. In the distant past. It must have been exciting.
Yeah. From what I can tell, Alexandria, the 2nd and 3rd centuries, was quite a intellectually stimulating city to be located in. And as mentioned, the Roman Empire had to bring down the Roman authorities, once they were Christian, had to bring down the hammer on those Alexandrians. There was Brian Murescu calls it a holocaust of just destruction of pagan, just like trying to shake the Etch-a-Sketch, right? So there can be no going back to it's the same logic with which the Bolsheviks assassinated the Romanovs, right? The idea is to make it so there's no way we can ever go back. And that was the idea, that was the thinking behind Christian emperors like Theodosius I. We just got to just eliminate all the pagan past so the future can only be Christian.
So is that how like the Library of Alexandria got destroyed?
Precisement. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. We're going to hear about Hypatia, who's a famous Greek philosopher, a lady philosopher from Alexandria. In fact, we should probably turn our attention to Hypatia once again. This is a great anecdote about Hypatia. So here we go. This again is from the Age of Faith here. Pagan professors of philosophy, after the death... Oh, excuse me. Wrong one. Hang on. The most interesting figure in the science of this age is that of the pagan mathematician and philosopher Hypatia. Her father Theon is the last man whose name is recorded as a professor at the Alexandrian Museum. He wrote a commentary on Ptolemy's Syntaxis and acknowledged the share of his daughter in its composition. Hypatia, says Suidas, wrote commentaries on Diophantus, the astronomical canon of Ptolemy, and on the conics of Apollonius of Perga. None of her work survives. From mathematics, she passed to philosophy and built her system on the lines of Plato and Plotinus, and according to the Christian historian Socrates, quote, far surpassed all the philosophers of her time, unquote. Appointed to the chair of philosophy at the museum, she drew to her lectures a large audience of varied and distant provenance. Some students fell in love with her, but she seems never to have married. Suidas would have us believe that she married, but remained a virgin nevertheless. Suidas transmits another tale, perhaps invented by her enemies, that when one youth importuned her, she impatiently raised her dress and said to him, quote, this symbol of unclean generation is what you were in love with and not anything beautiful, unquote. Wow. I love that. I mean, it's hard to imagine, some woman doing that, but yeah, she just did not care about her male suitors at all. Let's see. Not anything beautiful. She was so fond of philosophy that she would stop in the streets and explain to any who asked difficult points in Plato or Aristotle. Such was her self-possession and ease of manner, says Socrates, arising from the refinement and cultivation of her mind, that she not infrequently appeared before the city magistrates without ever losing in an assembly of men that dignified modesty of deportment for which she was conspicuous, and which gained for her universal respect and admiration. But the admiration was not quite universal. The Christians of Alexandria must have looked upon her askance, for she was not only a seductive unbeliever, but an intimate friend of Orestes, the pagan prefect of the city. When Archbishop Cyril instigated his monastic followers to expel the Jews from Alexandria, Orestes sent to Theodosius II an offensively impartial account of the incident. Some monks stoned the prefect. He had the leader of the mob arrested and tortured to death. Cyril's supporters charged Hypatia with being the chief influence upon Orestes. She alone, they argued, prevented a reconciliation between the prefect and the patriarch. One day, a band of fanatics, led by a reader or minor clerk on Cyril's staff, pulled her from her carriage, dragged her into a church, stripped her of her garments, battered her to death with tiles, tore her corpse to pieces, and burned the remains in a savage orgy. An act so inhumane, says Socrates, could not fail to bring the greatest opprobrium not only upon Cyril, but also upon the whole Alexandrian church. However, no personal punishment was exacted. The Emperor Theodosius II merely restricted the freedom of the monks to appear in public and excluded pagans from all public office. Cyril's victory was complete. You can kind of read in there the beginnings of the so-called, Christian Holocaust of the 2nd and 3rd centuries there. So Hypatia was something of a I guess she was like a noted female philosopher, and her life was forfeit in that aforementioned Christian Holocaust. So yeah, that'll send chills down the spine.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know how many female figures we've had the opportunity to bring up on the System Failure podcast, but there's one.
You like to hear of them. And I just love this thing where she just lifts her dress and be like, yeah, what you're in love with is not anything of consequence. Like, please, that's a waste of everyone's time. I love it. That's really great. Just such a good story. I have one more quote here on the university system in Athens that got closed down as part of this Christian, the building coming of the medieval era. So I guess I'll read that. It kind of shows you where Greek life comes from, like the fraternities and sororities that are a fixture in college life still today. Well, you can hear about it in this discussion of the closure of the universities of Athens. And here we go. Pagan professors of philosophy, after the death of Hypatia, sought security in Athens, where non-Christian teaching was still relatively and innocuously free. Student life was lively there. It enjoyed most of the consolations of higher education, fraternities, distinctive garbs, hazing, and a general hilarity. The Stoics, as well as the Epicurean schools, had now disappeared, but the Platonic Academy enjoyed a splendid decline under Themistius, Priscus, and Proclus. Themistius was destined to influence Averroes and other medieval thinkers by his commentaries on Aristotle. Priscus was for a time the friend and advisor of Julian. He was arrested by Valens and Valentinian I on a charge of using magic to give them a fever. He returned to Athens and taught there till his death at 90 in 395. Proclus, like a true Platonist, approached philosophy through mathematics. A man of scholastic patience, he collated the ideas of Greek philosophy into one system and gave it a superficially scientific form. But he felt the mystic nod of Neoplatonism too. By fasting and purification, he thought one might enter into communion with supernatural beings. The schools of Athens had lost all vitality when Justinian closed them in 529. Their work lay in rehearsing again and again the theories of the ancient masters. They were oppressed and stifled by the magnitude of their heritage. Their only deviations were into a mysticism that borrowed from the less orthodox moods of Christianity. Justinian closed the schools of the rhetoricians as well as of the philosophers, confiscated their property, and forbade any pagan to teach Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy, after 11 centuries of history, had come to an end. That's pretty good too. It kind of shows you where some of the Greek, as already mentioned, it shows you where some of the Greek flavor of the modern university came from. So I like that general hilarity was the way that the Durants described the schools of Athens in their last days. That's pretty good. And I got one more quote for you here, Brian. This one is really interesting because it's a description of Justinian. Now, Justinian was the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire during the 6th century, so think late 400s and early 500s. And he was the emperor of the Roman Empire after Rome had fallen, after Roman civilization had vanished from the Italian peninsula, right? So the thing that interests me here is that Durant is going to connect. Obviously, we've talked about how plagues are a defining hallmark of the collapse of authoritative regimes, just like the Black Death and COVID. Here we have the same thing. The Durants here are going to make a connection between Justinian's response to the Justinian plague, Diocletian's response to the Antonine plague, and the the Parliament of England, their response to the Black Death. So here we go. What's happening here is that whenever the plague comes around, regular workers get a leg up, and this is the response of the authorities every time, is to try to not allow working people to get one over on the rich, right? The way that the economy is supposed to work is that the rich get one over on the poor, but plagues create a situation where the poor can finally strike back a little bit, and then we can see what the universal response to that is from authority in the following quote from the Durants. Following Diocletian's example, Justinian sought to extend governmental control to all prices and wages. After the plague of 542, the labor supply fell, wages rose, and prices soared. Like the English Parliament of 1351 after the plague of 1348, Justinian sought to help employers and consumers by a price and wage decree. And this is a direct quote. We have learned that since the visitation of God, traders, artisans, husbandmen, and sailors have yielded to a spirit of covetousness and are demanding prices and wages 2 or 3 times as great as they formerly received. We forbid all such to demand higher wages or prices than before. We also forbid contractors for buildings or for agricultural or other work to pay the workmen more than was customary in old days. And then the Durant's note. We have no information as to the effect of this decree. But again, it really shows the way that history repeats itself, Brian? With the way that authority responds to plagues is, it's a pattern that plays out over and over again. Huh?
Well, I don't know like how great like the COVID has been for the workers. I mean, it seems like things have gotten worse because of like the CARES Act was a crazy cash grab by the upper class. But I mean, it has sort of revealed that the emperor is wearing no clothes more. But like the wages though have not improved, I would say.
Well, do you remember for a brief 12 or 18 month period during the darkest days of the COVID debacle, there was a moment where everyone was quitting en masse, remember that? And employers were struggling to fill positions, right? And they were having to give out huge wages. There was the thing, people were doing multiple, on Reddit it was a big theme, people were taking multiple jobs at home, right? Because their employers couldn't figure out that you had multiple jobs. So there was a moment where power swung briefly into the hands of the workers, but all of that's been rolled back in the years since, just as it did in the 1350s, and just as it did in the in the plague of 529, and just as it did after the Antonine plague that that was such a catastrophe for the Roman Empire during the second century. So, during the third century. So, yeah, pretty interesting stuff all around.
I suppose, to be fair, we're kind of still dealing with the fallout of it all.
Yeah.
Hopefully we secure our position, I guess.
Yeah. Yep. Totally agree there, Brian. And I think with that, we can put a wrap on the first half of today's podcast. And we'll be back very soon with some exciting clips for you all. I'm wicked excited for the second half of today's pod. I think it's going to be rollicking.
All right,
we'll do a short break and we'll be right back, folks. We'll see you then. And we're back. Well, alrighty, Brian, we have way too much to get to in this jam-packed second half, so we're going to dive right into it. Now, we have, obviously, the big news on the internet, or the podcastosphere, the past 2 weeks has been that ridiculous Douglas Murray, Dave Smith debate on the JRE. And obviously this week on the part of Dave Smith's Part of the Problem podcast, he had responses to Konstantin Kisin, who you read Konstantin's article on this very podcast last week. And I was scandalized at its utter lack of engagements with any of Smith's arguments. So we thought we might just revisit the Smith-Murray debate. We decided to go another direction with the clips. So we don't want to load you up all with a bunch more clips about that Douglas Murray debate, but we still have to settle the final hash on that one. And so, Brian, why don't you take it away and fix the wagon of Douglas Murray for us?
All right. Yeah. Well, I thought of something intelligent to say that I guess I was struggling with in the past few podcasts we did. But all right, well, here's the thing, and this is what I don't understand. Like, for some reason, the people who think that's very important say that, like, Winston Churchill is like an archon of good and that Hitler is an archon of evil are also the same people who think it's very important that, we keep blowing up Palestinians without any kind of like doubts about, the moral clarity of the situation.
Indiscriminate civilian bombing? You're opposed to indiscriminate civilian terror bombings?
Well, and so like the critics of this are like more willing to see like the shades of gray are also the same people who have doubts about blowing up these these civilians and think about like what it would be like to be trying to live in Gaza. And ultimately, well, the thing that they didn't really bring up on Joe Rogan to the extent that they should is that Douglas Murray is just like a self-described neocon, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote a book in 2006 called Neoconservative, Why We Need It. And the thing is he supported every single like foreign war that the United States has done over the past like 3 decades, basically, which is like a super like morally bankrupt position. And they really should have hammered this point, or Dave Smith should really brought the hammer down on Douglas Murray here. But really, Douglas Murray has absolutely no credibility, and it's insane that anyone would try to like hold him in the esteem of, being like an expert on these matters. Like really, it's extremely shameful, and it's a disgrace, basically. I mean, imagine like identifying like as a neocon.
Losing proposition in 2025, not so much during the darkest days of the Bush administration, but now, who would obviously you won't hear Murray mincing around and announcing himself on the podcast circuit as a neocon anymore, but a neocon he is and remains. And you're right, his track record is hot garbage, even though he's been there. Despite the fact that he's been there, he still calls balls and strikes wrong. You're saying, Brian, is that possible?
I don't know.
Lord, yeah.
I don't know. Seeing the shades of gray seems important. But I guess that makes you into some kind of anti-Semite.
Look, obviously Hitler is no angel, right? But he's also not the devil, right? And same with Churchill, right? Churchill is not an angel, but he's not the devil either. We want to land our opinion somewhere between the two extremes in the valley of reasonability, right? We don't want to use such a simplistic good, like devil versus God, devil versus angel rubric to understand history. History is always more complex than that. That is a simplified view of history designed to generate support for an ongoing, mop up of a civilian population in Gaza. Right? I mean, it's like Konstantin Kisin in his article that you read last week is a great example. There is no engagement with Smith's actual arguments, not at all. They have to dance around all that because of exactly what you said at the top of this half, right? They want to defend a civilian terror bombing campaign, and that's a losing argument. So they have to find these other arguments. Well, Smith's not an expert. You might arouse the anti-Semitic underbelly of the internet by making these claims, but obviously it's like holding ideas off the table of rational discussion there's just no way. I mean, especially now that the authorities have all been thoroughly discredited, you are going to actually have to litigate these issues in the public square. There's no getting around it. And the people who want to avoid litigating these issues in the public square, Konstantin Kisin, highly suspect in my book.
Penn Jillette said that being an intellectual means that your mind can be changed by information. I mean, I think there is a problem. Like, ideally, you would not start at your conclusions and work backwards. But I just don't think that's really the way the human mind works. And so we all start our conclusions and work backwards, basically, but you have to be able to challenge your conclusions and come to new ones if the information, that's the battle of existence and that's just what being an intellectual is actually trying to challenge your own conclusions, right? And
it was Karl Popper who said, "When I get new information, I change my mind, sir. What do you do?"
Yeah. And so, I don't know. I love the consistency of Dave Smith's philosophy, which is that we should just not be involved in these crazy foreign entanglements.
Is that really such a controversial conclusion to arrive at? Is that we're really going to have all of this acrimony over the idea that maybe Israel isn't only good here? The argument that that Hamas is only good is a horrible argument too, right? What you want to see is the shades of gray, the nuance. You want to be able to appreciate a very complex situation without simplifying it into caricatures of devil and angel.
So who's doing the mental gymnastics here? Is it is it the self-avowed neoconservative, or is it Dave Smith? And everyone can come to their own conclusions. But I guess we know where we stand on the System Failure podcast.
Yep. Agree totally, Brian. So obviously, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, everybody's favorite psychologist, was on the JRE this week again, on the JRE this week, partially in response to that Douglas Murray debate, although they didn't dive into it much. And I thought that Peterson was fairly charitable towards Dave Smith, even though they have different opinions on Israel. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, he said that he thought that both sides did a good job of articulating their position, which is at least pretty charitable from someone who seems to be for, bombing Palestinian women and children.
Yeah, yes. So we have a lengthy clip from JBP's appearance on the JRE, and we're going to, even though we are not going to play the parts where Peterson and Rogan talked about that debate, we're going to bring it all the way back around. And so I'm really excited to raise the curtain here and try to show the system failure audience what I'm seeing, because it's a very exciting way to view what's happening. So hopefully I can articulate this properly. And I think the best way to do it is to, I'm going to bring in the ideas of Dr. Eric Weinstein here, who is but Peterson and Weinstein are like the smartest dudes that I can still understand. You know, some people are too smart, and my brain have no idea what they're saying. But with Peterson and with Weinstein, even though I may not always know what they're talking about, at least I can figure out most of what they're saying. So again, these are like the smartest people that I can still comprehend. And I'm amazed at what they get right is brilliant, but I'm also amazed at what they're missing. And so that at the end we'll try to bring this all the way back around to to anti-Semitism or whatnot, or the Israel situation or information in general. So we are going to start here with a clip from Frame Problems. That's a YouTube channel. You can also visit Frame Problems on Substack, and these are excellent videos that Frame Problems has created to summarize the ideas of Dr. Eric Weinstein. And once they get started here, I think you'll understand why we've played this clip. So Brian, if you could fire up clip number 1 for us at your convenience.
In the late 1950s, a physicist named Derek de Solla Price began to study how science and technology were progressing. He did something relatively new for the time, applying quantitative scientific methods to the history of science itself. In 1961, he published his findings in a book called Science Since Babylon. And what he shared was pretty shocking. Take a look at this graph of the number of physics papers published since 1900. Other than a brief slowdown during World War II, it almost exactly follows an exponential curve. You can see the exact same thing on this graph of the number of people employed in electrical manufacturing. And this was true for everything. New PhDs, new journals founded. Since the time of the Industrial Revolution, all these different metrics of scientific and technological progress that Price measured had been growing exponentially. And I don't mean like a lot, I mean literally exponentially.
Then bam, we just explode, and we keep exploding at an ever-increasing rate.
But there's a massive problem here, and Price recognized it in his book. He warned that if the current rate of growth continued, there'd be dozens of scientists per man, woman, child, and dog of the world population, and a manpower shortage before the passage of another century. In essence, Price discovered that the entire process of the scientific and industrial revolutions was headed for diminishing returns, and that the growth to which we'd become accustomed during the past few centuries was, quote, not a permanent feature of our world.
And if science is the original seed corn, if you will, of technology and technology of economics, then effectively what's going to happen in science is going to percolate through a chain through technology and into the economy, with a potential stagnation coming.
And I believe that the Derek de Solla Price breaking of that trend happens in the late 60s, early 70s, and the growth pattern of the United States changes.
Well, there you have it. We find ourselves at the border between science and economics here, which is absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Dr. Weinstein. The idea I really want to highlight here is that science is the seed corn of technology, and technology is how we achieve economic growth during the Industrial Revolution, right? During the medieval period, the power was basically the church and the king, right? The king and the Christian church were the two, like the duopoly that controlled medieval society. But that state of affairs came crashing down after the Black Death and the Protestant Reformation, as we've hammered on many times in this podcast. I think everybody knows the story of the Protestant Reformation, generally speaking. The monopoly of the church, which was elevated in hierarchy over the kings, right, dissolved, and you ended up with the Protestant Reformation, the 30 Years' War, and the Peace of Westphalen in 1648, which established the nation state as we understand it today, right? The idea was we cannot have agents of the popes going around to all the various countries. These new, we're now going to call these kingdoms countries. We can't have the agents of the popes crossing these new international borders we're going to draw and trying to influence other countries on whether they become Protestant or Catholic, right? We're going to eliminate the Pope's ability to do that, and in fact subordinate the Pope, like essentially strip the papacy of its power, which it enjoyed through the entire Middle Ages. And what arose to replace this world order that got washed away in 1649? It was the central banks, which the first central bank popped up in England in 1694, right? The bank of there was like a Swedish central bank, but it didn't survive. Like the Bank of America is the oldest surviving central bank. What I'm proposing here is that the hierarchy of popes over kings was replaced with a new hierarchy of banks, elevated in a hierarchy over a nexus of entrepreneurs and scientists, right? The way the Industrial Revolution has worked since the 17th century is that entrepreneurs borrow money from the bankers, use that money to buy technology from the scientists, and then bring that technology to market to repay the loans they took out from the banks, right? That makes sense. Does it? Have I explained that in a way that seems cogent?
I think so.
Yeah. So what we have here is a system, like the banks loan money to entrepreneurs who then take technology from the scientists and bring it to market, right? And Weinstein's point here is that science, like the reservoir of new scientific discoveries, has to run thin. That science is not a source of unlimited, infinite growth till the end of time, that it's coming up against the real practical limits of economic growth. Why is that a big problem? It's because the banks loan money to entrepreneurs at compound interest rates, right? Like if you have the mob come around to your business and shake you down for tribute payments, that's all well and good. You can pay an increasing amount of tribute as long as your business is increasingly profitable, right? You can afford to pay off people above you in the pyramid scheme of capitalism so long as your business continues growing, right? The minute the entire economic pie stops growing, you have the bankers still collecting their compound interest, but the rest of society who are below them in the hierarchy has no way to grow their profits, and so you end up with a situation where all of the wealth is not the total economic pie is not growing; it's now stagnant. But the slices taken by the bankers is always growing according to the laws of compound interest. So if you don't have economic growth, the banks will suck up all the wealth in society to the point where you have massive polarizing, you have a huge wealth inequality, the kind that destabilizes societies like the Roman Empire or like America in the 21st century. And so it's interesting here that Weinstein thinks that it's the limitation. He can see the structure, right? He can see that science is the source of economic growth for the Industrial Revolution, but he fails to implicate compound interest here and just talks about the limitations of science itself. But the reality is that the problem is that we have a system predicated on growth and growth is unsustainable over the long haul. And so science here it's interesting. The implication of science is very interesting because during the Roman Empire, right, the reaction to the unfair economic hierarchy of the Roman Empire was Christianity, right? It was there was magic books, they had magic wands, they believed in a resurrection, that the sober Roman authorities said was impossible. But over the course of a couple hundred years, that magical revolt against sober Roman authority won the day and became the state religion of the Roman Empire and calcified it calcified into the same authority it once rebelled against, so that by the time the Black Death comes around in the mid 14th century, the church is now engaged in a war against a magical rebellion of its own, Renaissance magic, and your alchemist that we just read about at the top of the show. Obviously, the Inquisition was the church's version of throwing Christians to the lions in the Colosseum, right? You have a violent reaction by authority against a magical challenge to its power, both in the late Roman Empire and during the late Middle Ages, which makes me think we should expect to see a magical challenge to our own sober authorities in the current day and age, and those people are the scientists, right? Not only do they supply us with economic growth, but there are priesthood that tells us what's so and what's not so. That used to be the job of the Catholic clergy, now it's the job of scientists. And then, of course, I just forgot to mention that science morphs into magic, right? You can be Sir Isaac Newton, discover calculus, advance science through your laws of gravitation, and still be a committed alchemist at the same time. And that was in the 18th century. So it really shows you, I guess it was the early 18th century, maybe late 17th. But it really goes to show you how the relationship between science and magic. Obviously, the banking house of the Medicis in Florence were the first people to stumble on magic as a way of opposing the power of the Vatican, 150 miles to their south. And it was the textbooks of 2nd and 3rd century Alexandria that the Medicis became keenly interested, even though those books were verboten. They were forbidden by the Catholic Church. So you can see where the beginning of just the Medicis themselves, and their obsession with magic, you can see where the Medicis were the first people to really challenge the Vatican to power. And some would say successful. Pope Leo X was a Medici. So you could say the Medicis had so much money that they could insulate themselves from the retribution from Rome and even managed to take Rome over by seating 2 of their own family members on the throne of St. Peter. So again, all right, so we're almost ready for our lengthy Jordan Peterson clip here, but I just want to mention also the theme of this section is going to be parasites. You're going to hear Dr. Jordan Peterson lay out his economic theory about what's wrong in the 21st century in America and Canada, and he's going to give a lengthy expose on parasites. So this is a longer clip, so we're going to, whenever we have something to say, we'll just have Brian stop the clip and we'll jump in because it's 8 minutes, but it's important for Dr. Peterson to lay out his theory here. And when Dr. Peterson is speaking of parasites, I just want everyone to remember Dr. Michael Hudson's book, Killing the Host, in which he outlined the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, as a parasite that is consuming modern society, in much the way I just laid out, using compound interest. And so, Brian, if you would, could we get started hearing from everyone's favorite psychologist, the august Dr. Jordan Peterson?
That's the eternal parasite problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so organisms build up a storehouse of value, a carcass, let's say, like a whale carcass, for example, and inevitably the parasites move in to invade it, inevitably. Mm-hmm. And that's so consistent a pattern that sex evolved to stop it.
How so?
Well, parasites can reproduce faster than their hosts because they're simpler, and so they can swarm the host quite rapidly, especially if the host clones itself, because the host then stays identical physiologically across the generations. So the parasites can optimize to colonize the host, and that's the end of it. If you reproduce sexually, you mix your genes up. You pay a price. You lose 50% of your specific genetic heritage. But the advantage is you stay ahead of the parasites. So sex evolved to outwit the parasites. And a huge part of what we're seeing around us, and this is probably a consequence at the lowest level, base level, we've had a phenomenal boom in wealth since World War II. Phenomenal. We stored wealth everywhere. Like in Harvard at a $53 billion endowment. Well, the parasites found the wealth everywhere.
Yeah.
And they've invaded like mad.
That's a great example of it.
Hey,
Parasites in academia are a great example of what you're talking
media,
about. Unearned.
Legacy media.
Yes.
Science has science has been invaded
right
that
there?
way.
Yes.
The political, this is a major problem.
You heard Joe Rogan say the magic word just there. Unearned. That's what this is all about, right? You see, because in the early capitalists, right, they were the John Stuart Mills, the Adam Smiths, David Ricardo. These guys were very concerned with earned versus unearned income. Their problem was that the old feudal landlords, right, these guys are still the revolution against the old medieval world order. The old medieval economic order is still ongoing by the time the early capitalists come around and start observing what's happening. And the idea of these early capitalists was that we've got to tax the hell out of the rentier class, meaning people who make their money on property instead of making their money through the actual provision of goods and services. Because you see the old feudal landlords whose ancestors had conquered the land in the 11th century, by the time the 16th and 1700s were rolling around, they realized that with the factories that were being built, they could help themselves to the profits of the people who built the factories by simply jacking up the rent on the workers of the people of the workers of the people who own the factories, right? So, but the capitalist, in other words, has to cover the living costs of all their workers, or the workers will not show up to work anymore, right? And so the landlord just kept jacking up the minimum living cost until you had these guys writing books saying, "Hey, we gotta tax away that unearned income. Right? We have to make a distinction between earned income, where you're actually expanding the size of the overall economic pie, and unearned income, where you're just scalping already existing labor and already existing value. Earned versus unearned income. In the 1890s, you had the whole libertarian, like we love Dave Smith, but his whole libertarian thing is based on the Austrian school of economics. And what was this is, again, the late 1900s, right? So you've got your classical economists, and then you've got this revolution in thought. You've got Marx, who comes along and he lays out obviously technology is going to, technology is the thing Marx identified as the ever-present threat to capitalism, right? And it's the same thing that Weinstein identified in the video before, like science. Technology is going to make the capitalist, is going to obviate the role of workers in the capitalist system, so you're guaranteed to have a revolution at some point, was Marx's fundamental idea. And then by Capital Volume 3, published posthumously in 1892, Marx really laid out the financial aspect with his idea of falling rate of profit, right? This idea of falling rate of profit, really, his prophecy was, it's going to be the financial sector from which the derangement that will bring down the capitalist system is going to originate. Right? It's a simple idea. How fast does GDP grow? 2-3%. How fast does the wealth of the rich grow? 8 to 12%, right? And so if the economy is not growing at 8 to 12%, but the rich are, then they're consuming ever more slices of the economic pizza for themselves, leaving only a few slices for actual workers like you and me. So, all right, we can continue the clip there, but Joe Rogan, the unearned thing, he's getting to the heart of it. Peterson won't pick up on it. Peterson is on about his great parasite theory, but he just is unable here to... The man's brilliant, but he's just unable to identify the parasites because, of course, parasites hide their presence. So it's a universal feature of parasites. Anyway, Brian, much more on that after we hear more from Dr. Peterson.
Right.
And so how do you protect yourself against the parasitical exploiters?
Well, you could recognize parasitical behavior, right? When everything gets chalked off to racism and white supremacy, when they start using these pejoratives, they start throwing those around for everything. That's one of the ways you recognize. You're like,
that's right.
You're a parasite.
Can we pause again?
You're not really doing something.
You're getting close here. You can see why, they're able to identify here, or Rogan is, that these ideas of accusing people of racism is like a sign. That's the people who are accusing people of racism are not themselves the parasites. They're covering for parasites by, instead of having a discussion about taxing the wealthy, we're going to have a discussion about proper pronouns or something like that instead. So obviously, we can't have any acknowledgement of the Marxist analysis of the situation, and we can't have people waking up to the distinct, the whole point of earned versus unearned, of obfuscating earned versus unearned income. Right? The whole point of getting away with that is so people can't tell when they're being parasitized. And we had the august Dr. Michael Hudson on this very pod explaining that the subjective theory of value from the Austrian school is the very mechanism by which the parasite hides its presence, right? The subjective theory of value is if you're starving in the desert, Brian, you're going to pay a lot of money for a glass of water, whereas if I'm swimming in the ocean, a glass of water is not going to be all that valuable to me. So the idea behind the Austrian school is that value is totally subjective. And so if there's a voluntary exchange, well, that must mean that it was a win-win for both parties, right? The fact that you're starving in the desert and I charged you $50,000 for a glass of water, it cannot be a ripoff. The fact that you paid means it was worth it to you, right? You can see the problem with this, right? Obviously, housing market, if there's not enough houses, you're going to get the price is going to be jacked up. Obviously, just because an exchange was voluntary does not mean that it's a win-win, right? There can be a parasitic exchange in which the person being parasitized has got no choice whatsoever.
All right. Well, see, the glass of water example, to me, doesn't seem like the problem so much.
How so?
I mean, well, first of all, I question the bit about where... Well, we have this, embedded growth obligation, right?
Yeah, we'll get to that. But yeah, egos, yes.
Well, that part, makes sense. And so we have to keep growing the economy. See, it doesn't seem like there should be limitations on scientific discoveries, although that's a whole another bag of worms, basically, or can of worms.
But obviously an exponential growth in the number of scientific papers published is unsustainable by definition, surely. You agree with that?
Well, there's just, obviously, in the 50s, we were dreaming about the Jetsons and flying cars and whatnot, and that's all stopped for the most part. And, And part of the problem seems to be that, our universities have become captured. And, we've talked about it in the past, and maybe we're going to talk about it more here. But there does seem to be, some kind of cap on scientific progress or something. Weinstein talks a lot about, Epstein, being involved in universities and whatnot. It's all very suspect that maybe scientific progress is being stifled. Or we can't get past Einsteinian physics, basically. Okay. Well, anyway, so that whole conundrum there seems like a separate matter that when people are in... when there's a hurricane, the price of plywood, goes through the roof because people are being, they gotta exploit people for the cost of wood. Well, that doesn't really seem like the same kind of systemic problem, I guess, as this whole, embedded growth situation.
Yeah, okay. I see what you're saying, and I'm not trying to defend Weinstein's idea that science is running out, and that's my idea is that it's actually compound interest. That's where the structural limitation comes in, and that. Just economic growth in general. There's going to be real world limits to economic growth, right? You want a sustainable society, not one that's a exponential graph. That's what the Roman Empire was. We're just going to grow until we collapse. What you want is sustainability. And then the other issue there, it's what you're talking about, like hurricanes and the prices of wood going up. So what you would want to do is declare that unearned income. But the real place where unearned income helps us, where the distinction between earned and unearned income helps us, is when it comes time to tax the wealthy, right? What we need is broad popular support for taxing away unearned income to disincentivize people from trying to make a living off of owning property. We want to incentivize people to make a living off of working and providing actual goods and services. So that is where the distinction, cracking down on price gouges during a hurricane, well, that's not going to save the economy. But taxing wealth away from where it is pooling up uselessly and redistributing it to where it is sorely needed is the only way to keep the water cycle that is our economy, spinning. If you have all of your money pooling up uselessly in one place, then eventually you will not be able to have. It's the flow of wealth that's important, not the accumulation of wealth in any one node in the system. So I'm just saying that the lack of distinction between earned and unearned income has allowed finance, insurance, and real estate to take over our economy, but all of those are about scalping existing assets versus creating new ones, right? So we want to be really careful how much we allow people to live off of scalping assets. Otherwise, you end up with a explosion of wealth inequality that threatens the very fabric of society. Too many people are setting up toll booths, in other words, and not enough people are paving roads. Right?
It does seem to be the American way.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
It's obviously, I guess this whole setup is designed to create peace after World War II.
Pax Americana. Yes.
Yeah, but it does come with its own subset of problems. But I guess with the plywood example, taxing as unearned income does seem like a reasonable solution.
Yeah.
But there is the problem though, where if you don't, if we're marooned in the desert and I don't know, someone has some water, well, we're going to quickly, it's just a method of distribution. We're going to quickly drink all the water. It will be gone quickly. But obviously there is a problem where if you jack up the price though, only the rich can afford it.
Yes. Well, you have outlined a fundamental problem with markets. Now, I am a big advocate. I like markets. They obviously don't apply in every economic situation. There needs to be competition. In the absence of competition, there can be no markets. But when there is competition, I love a market. But one of the big problems with markets is that when resources are scarce, right? You just said it. Markets are a distribution scheme. And when resources are scarce, the rich little old lady is going to buy up all the milk to feed her kittens. Well, poor people with human children will starve because they can't afford the milk because the price has been bid up through markets. So there are some issues with markets that need to be worked out, but I don't have a better way for situations where in which consumers can choose who they buy from. And what I'm saying is, in a context of competition, markets are the best distribution scheme that I know of. You're identifying a problem with markets here, and markets are great, but again, the issue is we want to tax unearned income so as not to distort markets and end up with $500,000 for every house. Even though they're not worth that, it's just we're all taking out loans that incorporate the speculative value of the house into the cost of living, so they just keep going up and up and up, and the price of rent keeps going up and up and up. So yes, yeah, all of our, like, if we taxed away unearned income, that would eliminate like the crazy high rents, right? No, you would be not so profitable to buy a house and rent it out if you tax the hell out of that situation, right? The person would, their investment wouldn't be very profitable, and they would end up selling it. You know? So that's the idea here, is that if you the what's happening, the skyrocketing housing prices is what is a reflection of the rich buying up all of the poor's property, right, and accumulating all the property for themselves. And obviously, when they're done with the private sector, they'll be on to the government sector, where they'll extract all the assets there. And then when there's no more assets, I guess our capitalist oligarchs will go overseas and try to exploit there, you know, wherever they can. But yes, it's earned versus unearned income. We're going to hear Dr. Peterson, you know, go on and on about the psychopaths who are parasitizing the system, and he'll never sniff the finance, insurance, and real estate sectors as the true culprits of the social unrest that we've been going through and the political unhappiness that's brought us the Donald. So can we proceed, Brian?
Science, you're not really doing academics.
Well, one of the hallmarks of identification from the clinical literature for the cluster B types, and so they have a parasitical element, histrionic, narcissistic, psychopathic, criminal, right? That's cluster B. They use false claims of victimization to manipulate.
Yes.
And so this is a particularly pernicious pathway because they parasitize empathy. Right. And the left is unbelievably susceptible to that because the left is full of empathic people.
Right.
And so those who parasitize empathy have a field day on the left.
Right. Because
so
the left is generally thought to be more educated, more compassionate, kinder, looking out for marginalized people. That's part of the ethics of it all.
The ethic is pretty straightforward. Anything that cries is a baby. It's like, no, some things that cry are monsters.
Ooh.
Right. Well, let's take the case of Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish Prime Minister, the previous Scottish Prime Minister. Any man who wants to can be a woman. It's like, okay, any man. You mean any man, do you? Yeah. Have you encountered the nightmare men? Oh, they don't exist. They're all victims. Yeah. You just bloody well wait till you encounter one. You'll change your story very rapidly. And for the naive and sheltered empaths of the radical left, they're either psychopaths, so they're wolves in sheep clothing, or they're people that are so naive that the what would you say, Red Riding Hood's grandmother can definitely have his way with them.
Yes, that's literally something that I use as an example in my Netflix special. I said that I think there are people that feel like they're trapped in a woman's body, and then there's also people that are out of their fucking mind. They're crazy, and that
they're
all
not
throughout
just
history.
crazy.
But what I pointed out all throughout history, when you wanted to make like a killer in a movie scarier, you put him in a dress, like Norman Bates in Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and I used the Big Bad Wolf. I'm like, it's literally a wolf dressed up like a woman. Like, that's literally what it is. And they've somehow or another completely abandoned this one aspect of masculinity that's one of the more terrifying, is the predatory pervert. And they've given the predatory pervert a privileged position.
Well, like John Oliver, you know, he had a bit about, transgenderism stuff, and like one of his, he's coming on like the left side that, you know, Jordan Peterson speaking about here. And he just had this case study about this kid who like wanted to play on the girls softball team. He was like this effeminate dude, and you know, he was like the backup catcher or something, and you know, he was terrible at the sport, but he seemed to enjoy playing on the team a whole bunch. And you know, he's trying to say like, why can't this kid, you know, be allowed to play on the softball team? And certainly that kid is like not a threat to anyone, right? But they are making a good point. There are going to be psychopaths too, and so like, how do you like sort out this problem?
Oh, it's a brilliant distraction, right? Like, what's happening here is Peterson. He's like trashing the distraction as a parasite, the distraction from the parasites. He's brilliantly trashing the distraction, right? It's not that obviously this is what makes this such a valuable distraction, because there are two sides to the story, right? There's perfectly reasonable people that feel like they're born in the wrong body, right? I mean, that's like a perfectly reasonable thing that can happen to a person. Not very common, but it can definitely happen. But then you have, you know, who's Peterson's talking about, like the pervs who want to if we just have anyone who declares himself a woman can just get into a woman's locker room, that's not a good situation. That's a situation obviously ripe for abuse. So what's happening to me, in my view, I mean, Peterson is just taking the stuffing out of a straw man here. A straw man deliberately set up to distract us all from the ongoing privations of the financial class. Obviously, at the end of this, we'll tie this all back into Israel too. Yes, it's that's what makes it such a good distraction. I'm agreeing with what you're saying. Like, yeah, there are people who born in the wrong gendered body who are worthy of our empathy. And then there's like, well, all women are women, which is like, okay, well, that's a bridge too far. Now we have to argue about that. And Peterson's great at it, just absolutely shredding that. The guy's got decades of clinical experience. It's easy for him to take that apart. But he gets so busy, he never suspects the true parasite that's strangling the host of the U.S. economy here.
Yeah, well, he's not likely to get into Marxism, unfortunately.
Dude, and like I remember when he had the debate with Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian Marxist, and he had like read the Communist Manifesto and just totally didn't quite get it. So yeah, he just obviously was coming into it with this odd anti-Marxist brainwashing that just made him incapable of really grappling with the Communist Manifesto. And it seemed like he'd never read it before that debate. It seemed like he was new to the ideas. So, yep, I agree with you. Yeah.
Right.
And that's
Eve's sin, by the way.
One of the craziest things about it is they've completely abandoned the idea of the pedophile and then the monster and the sexual pervert, and the attacker, the assaulter, the person who, when you give a guy, you say, all you have to do is say you're a woman. Mm-hmm. Now you have access to whatever women's spaces, all the women's spaces. You could victimize them. You could fight them. You could beat them in sports. You could dominate them in all games. It's bizarre that no one's caught on to that. And that's
for sure.
That's the weirder, that's the more cult-like and even, you could say, religious aspect of leftist thinking.
It's an original sin. Eve clutches the serpent to her breast. Ooh. It's like, that's a serpent.
Right.
It's poison. Yeah. You don't get to love it. Right. It's a monster.
Right.
Right.
It's a guy wearing a dress with an erection in the women's room.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. Or worse.
Yeah, or worse.
Or worse.
Yeah, or a lot worse, yeah.
Well, right. And there are no shortage of naive people who've never really encountered a monster and have no imagination for it.
But there's also people that are willing to justify the monster's behavior because the monster's a part of a protected class now.
Yeah, well, that's part of that.
Which is crazy.
Well, the cluster B types use proclamation of victimization to parasitize. That's part of their clinical pathology.
And they're
Poor me, I get to do anything.
And they're so common.
Yeah.
That's what's really crazy. And why is it that academia is overwhelmed by people like this? Is it because it's vulnerable to parasites?
Sure, why not? It was a storehouse of unguarded value.
Without any religious principles.
Well, also, there's that too, and with no real gatekeepers.
Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, just with regard to the question of like, why is academia overrun with this thought? I mean, because like we can't address Marxism directly, right?
Yes, yeah, they've been on the take all along, the folks at academia. And you did mention earlier, Brian, that you thought that it doesn't, like Weinstein's analysis that science is limited in what it can produce in terms of wonders. Right? I think that there is an aspect of this where part of the reason that science is having trouble coming up with the economic growth that it did, during the 17, 18, and 1900s is because they jettisoned the magical insight that you can find in a book like the Corpus Hermeticum that says you must make yourself equal to God, for like understands like. Only if you become equal to God can you apprehend God, right? Or this idea that the universe is an illusion of that we are partial. It's not the case that, like with the placebo effect, right? There is such things as like a drug that would be stronger than the placebo effect, right? So like the placebo effect, we're clearly creating this reality with our mind, but there's also something pushing back there too. So the idea with Hermeticism and the magical tradition in general, or Neoplatonism, is this idea that we are co-partners with God in the act of creation. We aren't just experiencers. We like in your dreams, we are also creating it. And I think that jettisoning that insight for the convenience of power has hobbled hobbled science. So science is like a hobbled version of magic. Now the authorities hate magic for any number of reasons, but like obviously, if people realize that reality is an illusion, they're not going to show up to their crummy job, and punch the clock for you 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, whatever it is. So the authorities always want to push back on the magical insight, and you can just see where they've neutered magic by making it into science, by removing that insight from the equation. And now science is screwed. They've got the placebo effect, the double slit experiment. They've got retrocausality proven statistically. But they can't hold the press conference and admit that reality is an illusion. They're stuck. And I think that's what accounts for the not being able to surpass Einsteinian physics. Just my guess. I don't really know, but that's what I think.
It seems related, or I mean, just the Einsteinian, or just the conception, that we're like creating this reality.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Yeah, it's science says no. I will be objective. I will be as objective observer as possible. But the magical insight is that there is no such thing as an objective observer. There cannot be, since observing a thing affects it. Observing a thing changes it. So, not sure what's up with the sciences, but boy, howdy! When you talk about a corrupt authority, it's going to be science. I think is going to stand revealed in posterity as one of the great examples of a corrupt authority in all of history, even worse than the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. It's just so tempting to abuse your power as the arbiter of what's real and not real. Like if people look to you to tell them what is real and what's not real, boy, it's just so much power. It's just tempting to abuse it. And I think that's what's been going on with the priesthood of science during the 20th century.
Like the parasite problem is a very deep problem. So I can even give you an example of that. This is a hard one, but I'll try. In the Pinocchio movie, this also happens in Jonah, the story of Jonah. Remember, Geppetto ends up in a whale. It's like, what the hell? There's no explanation for that in the story. It's like he's out looking for Pinocchio, and now he's in a whale. Well, a whale is a giant carcass, right? And so when something dies, its spirit, what would you say? Its spirit is then embedded in a carcass. That's a good way of thinking about it. That's why Pinocchio has to go into the belly of the whale to free Geppetto and finish his transformation, is that when things deteriorate, right, you have these carcasses lying around with their dead spirits. The spirit of what gave rise to them is still inside there. And the job is to go into the carcass and to revitalize the spirit that produced it and not to parasitize it. Right.
Boy, I don't know how you got that out of Pinocchio and the whale.
Well,
I'm trying to follow you on this one. I'm like, wow.
Geppetto ends up languishing in the whale.
Right.
Right?
Uh-huh.
So imagine that there's a spirit in the universities that gave rise to these great storehouses of value. And that spirit has disintegrated, and now it's inside the storehouse. That's a good way of thinking about it. It's inside the storehouse. Your job as someone who wants to become real is to go into the storehouses of value that have been bequeathed to us by the past and to discover and revitalize the spirit that gave rise to them, not to parasitize them.
And when they parasitize
They
them,
strip them to their bones and there's nothing left.
and they do it obviously, right? There's plagiarism, there's all these different and all that
False
stuff.
scientific papers.
Yes,
Yeah,
and all that
everything
stuff
gets gamed.
all that gets swept under the rug because the
Yeah.
people that are doing it are part of the protected class.
Yeah.
So they protect the parasites. Like, this is
Yeah.
my lamprey.
Yeah.
Like, don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Joe Rogan obviously hasn't listened to Peterson's extended breakdown of the archetypal imagery in Pinocchio.
Yeah, I loved it too when the man brought up Pinocchio. Of course, Dr. Peterson's going to bring up Pinocchio. It wouldn't be a proper Dr. Peterson podcast without a reference to that work, huh?
Indeed.
Man, it's just so interesting to hear. Like, that is absolutely brilliant. Like, archetypal mythological analysis. It's absolute destruction of the ridiculous straw man, which the left has become. But all the while, not able to put our fingers on the pulse of the actual problem. I mean, Dr. Peterson is brilliant, but it's just that he hasn't been exposed to the right ideas, right? It's like he hasn't quite got over the finish line.
Well, that's just what we need to do, right? Is go into the belly of the whale that is like the left, and find the Marxist spirit that dwells within, and bring it to the surface, right?
I had a similar idea when you were talking earlier about religion. I almost said it, but like with the Catholic Church, what we got to do is like we've got these crazy people in the cabin piloting this aircraft of religion, and we got to get up in the cockpit and elbow them aside and take over the controls. And revivify institutions of science, religion, and economics such that they serve a glorious future instead of a tiny egoic few or a tiny egoic minority among us. I think maybe we should go right into clip number 3 here, Brian, and then I got a couple more points, and then that'll do it for today.
To understand why this stagnation is such a problem, you have to understand that during this period from 1945 to 1971, growth became an expectation, not just psychologically, but in the very structure of our institutions. Weinstein has a term for these built-in expectations. He calls them
Egos, that is, embedded growth obligations.
That is the central unifying idea that I have as to why so much has changed so seriously.
Here's the idea. Imagine a law firm with a certain number of partners. Each of these partners has beneath them a certain number of associates, most of whom hope to become partners. They've all invested tons of time and money in a very specialized education with that promise in mind. As long as the firm continues to grow at an appreciable rate, that promise can be kept. But the moment growth slows or stagnates, things start looking like a pyramid scheme very quickly. This is the embedded growth obligation for the law firm.
An embedded growth obligation is how fast a structure has to grow in order to maintain its honest positions.
Because when it becomes a Ponzi scheme, it will have to be headed by somebody who is willing to lie to new entrants about the nature of that scheme.
These embedded growth obligations show up everywhere. In academic research, in corporate hierarchies, in pension plans. And because so many of them were entrenched during the post-war era, when progress in science and tech were still on an exponential curve, they expect a rate of growth that doesn't exist anymore.
If you believe that 1945 to 1971-73 is normal, you built your organization with the idea that it would always grow.
In effect, we built an entire economy on Borston's extravagant expectations, and then the engine for meeting those expectations gave out.
I came to understand that there was a big story that was going to affect everything that I cared about. It was going to affect the markets, it was going to affect our families, and that story is the story of what happens when humans get addicted to high levels of broadly distributed, stable, technology-led growth, and then are denied the ability to continue on that path. That means that you're set up potentially for war, for civil unrest.
Pretty straightforward. Weinstein goes through all of that. He's just talking about how growth is growth is crucial, right? But it's a really simple idea. If the person to whom you have to pay tribute demands an ever-increasing amount of tribute, like the banks with their compound interest, then you must make an ever-increasing amount of money to pay off those landlords or become gradually poorer until you have nothing left, right? So that's why economic growth is so critical. And Weinstein really intelligently gives some concrete examples of what that might look like in terms of the way that our modern society is structured. He's talking about lying to new entrances. Like the head of the law firm has to lie to the potential partners who are currently associates about their chances of actually becoming partners, because there's only 1 or 2 partner slots, and there's a half dozen possible people that could fill that role. He ties this into kayfabe, the idea of layered layers of reality and fakery in wrestling, pro wrestling. Like some things are real, some things are fake, and when you get a bunch of strata of reality and fakery together, it becomes really difficult to tell where the fakery ends and the real show begins. It's very confusing. It really plays with that line between fiction and nonfiction. And that really is if you go online, I forgot the name of this parasite, but there's a parasite that will, like a fish. Have you ever seen this fish parasite where it dissolves the tongue of the fish and replaces the tongue with its own body, right? The fish loses its tongue, right? Its tongue gets eaten by a parasite, but then the parasite acts as the fish's new tongue and steals all of its nutrients until it starves to death. And the point is, every parasite has a way of preventing the host from becoming aware that it is being parasitized. And that is what we're seeing here with the international banking houses that run international politics in the way that the popes once ran international politics. And there is definitely some connection between the creation of the State of Israel and these old European banking families. This is where people will start to bring out the anti-Semitism, but you just heard it a second ago. Rogan was talking about leveraging accusations of racism or bigotry against people as a way of preventing them from making a serious critique of the system. And so when you note that the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was written from the foreign minister of the UK to Lord Rothschild about the creation of the State of Israel, you're like, oh, okay, so there is some shadowy connection here between whatever is happening in Israel and the international banking houses that run the show from behind the curtain. And running the show from behind the curtain is just the classic behavior of parasites, and that is why Dave Smith got the reaction he gets. Right, they're leveraging the same straw man that Peterson falls for. And in some cases, Peterson himself they make him into the straw man, so that we can't ever argue about taxing away excess wealth. So we can stick with the neoliberal paradigm of dropping taxes on the wealthy in hopes that you'll get a trickle-down effect, right? This has been our politics since the 1980s. Weinstein mentioned the era when growth was really coming to an end as the 1970s in the clip we just heard. But like the 70s is when technology allowed capitalists in America to offshore all their jobs to foreign lands and replace huge amount of workers en masse. Like 1970s is when the spreadsheet comes into play. Like my job as an accountant would take, you would need like 20 of me if I didn't have Microsoft Excel or some similar spreadsheet program. And then the third factor, of course, is the rise of second wave feminism and the intentional destruction of the labor market through this leftist apparatus of empathy. Obviously second wave feminism was addressing a real abusive problem with the American economy, but did it in a way that benefits the capitalist class and doubles the number of workers in the labor market, thereby doubling supply. That's gonna put severe downward pressure on the price of wages. And that has really, the 1970s was really the era in which the wealth accumulated by the middle class because of the World War II and the New Deal Great Depression policies, the rich clawed all that back starting in the 1970s, culminating in the administration of Ronald Reagan and the dropping of taxes on the wealthy to almost nothing in an attempt to stimulate economic growth through neoliberal policies. It's been a disaster. 2008 was our comeuppance for for that policy. And now here we are, unable to adjust course, unable to suggest taxing the rich like we did in the 1950s and 60s. There's just no political will for that because people are very much confused. The parasite has successfully anesthetized the host from realizing that it's there, and you and me have to listen to brilliant men like Eric Weinstein and Jordan Peterson tap dance all around it, but never see the true source of the problem that is plaguing American society. That is my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah. Well, the bloated whale of the middle class, or something had to come for it, and that is just what happened.
Well, I do think that. I think that taxing the wealthy will give our jumbo jet a much longer runway to land the capitalist plane. Right, like we need to come up with some as technology makes workers less and less relevant to the economy. We need to find some way to preserve an equal distribution of wealth, and capitalism is flawed fundamentally in that regard. It means we're going to need a new system to replace capitalism, as capitalism replaced the feudal society of the Middle Ages, and as the feudal society of the Middle Ages replaced the slave system of Rome.
Well, I guess what I think we need is like awareness, right? I mean, the first step is to not be like anesthetized to the parasitic situation, and in I guess a lot of ways, we're not like sent off to war, although certainly people were drafted back in Nam like in '67. But anyway, we're not out there like fighting wars. But I don't know. Anyway, we got to like raise our awareness to what's going on.
We are in an intellectual dogfight for the ages, Brian. You've said it brilliantly, and that's what brings us on the microphones every weekend, because spreading these ideas is the only anecdote. It's the only way to avoid another dark age. We just got to come on here every weekend and keep making the point, because you're right. Awareness is the antidote to parasitism. Right? If the minute an organism becomes aware that it's being parasitized, it will do what it can to remove that parasite. So we need to spread awareness that we're being parasitized. That's why it's so important that everyone rush to the bookstore and buy them out of their stock of Michael Hudson books and start cracking, because they're just brilliant ideas, unattenuated by the intellectual malaise that we just heard these two brilliant men mired in. Yes.
Well, so I guess just my question for you though is like, if we're able to accomplish if the masses become, less anesthetized or not anesthetized, I mean, does that mean we need like a financial overthrow or an overthrow of our financial system? or right?
Yeah. So we do need an overthrow of the financial system. Part of the way the thing about the libertarians is they can see the problem with the central banks. They can see how the central banks are a scam. But they just aren't able to see that taxing the ever-loving hell out of them is the way to fix it, because they're opposed to taxes.
See, I think that some kind of like embedded growth obligation maybe seems in line with the fact that the human population is going to continue to grow, right?
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's what compound interest is, a mathematical calculation that's meant to mimic the way that herds of cattle grow, or that like your barley fields grow, right? If you have a handful of grains now, after the growing season, you'll have many more grains because the life reproduces itself exponentially, right? But the problem is that the model, compound interest, the mathematical model, does not have any way to account for like floods or hurricanes or wars or whatever the thing is, right? And it used to be the case that whenever one of those catastrophic events would come around, the kings would have to declare a debt forgiveness so that the creditors didn't foreclose on their entire country and then challenge the king for power. Why was I talking about that? Well, I've lost it now. But the point, what was your original question, Brian?
Well, just is like a overthrow of the system necessary?
Yeah. Man, it could be if our leaders could just stop killing the golden goose and realize that caring for the golden goose is the way to get richer in the long term. There's no reason why we couldn't, but it just doesn't. The system isn't. The wealthy as an aggregate aren't sophisticated enough to do that. All they can do is chase short-term profits because that's how our system is structured. And it's human nature. All throughout history, the rich have like gone too far, killed the golden goose, blown up their own society, ended up themselves penniless.
Right. Well, the great, like Machiavelli's The Prince, famously, people think it's a story about how to be Machiavellian, but really it's like a warning. And that's why this book is like so important. And I don't know, like ultimately, I guess I'm like less convinced that overthrow of the system is important as much as like awareness and how to act. But if people like raise their awareness, it's like that will force the powers that be to like act differently, right?
Yeah, I do see where awareness. What we could do is generate broad support for taxing the ever-loving hell out the wealthy, like we're used to. Like that would be a way that we could forestall the collapse of the capitalist system and keep it going until we can figure out how to run an economy that doesn't really need all that many workers thanks to technology. So I guess we need a system that knows how to deal with the fact that we don't really need that many workers anymore thanks to technology. We need to develop that system. That's going to mean trying new things, trial and error, But in the meantime, we can give ourselves time to come up with this new system by bringing down the hammer on the wealthy who are just gutting this society.
Well, the system kind of does like create the ability to raise that awareness, though, like, through the glories of like podcasting and whatnot. I mean, it does seem to be doing something.
Well, podcasting seems like it's outside the system, right? In the way that Christianity originated outside. You wouldn't say that the rise of Christianity shows that the Roman system is working. The rise of Christianity shows that the Roman system is rotten. Feel the same way about podcasts, right? If our media wasn't corrupt, you probably wouldn't have seen the rise of podcasts that we have seen. Like, obviously, this wouldn't be the podcast election if the legacy media had not been derelict in their duty, right?
Well, like homeostasis, it would be like ideal so that, we wouldn't have to constantly adapt and change, but it's just not really the nature of things, right? And so obviously Christianity is the bohemian, rebellious upstart, but then it gets co-opted, and that's just the way it goes, right?
Yeah.
Until the next thing comes along.
Yeah.
I
think the rebellion against the economic hierarchy is the last two times it has been magic in nature. So I think that we should look to the lunatic fringes of society where the whispers of magic start to get louder and louder as the centralized authority looks more and more corrupt and intellectually bankrupt. So I think that encouraging people to think outside the box in terms of Marxist economics, encouraging people to think outside the box in terms of neoliberalism, and encouraging people to think outside the box in terms of magic is what we can do on this podcast to help roll this busted Winnebago up the hill, huh? All right. Well, any other comments or questions from you, Brian, before we put a wrap on this exciting episode of the System Failure Podcast? Do you think we paid off my exciting boast at the beginning? I feel like we did. What are your thoughts?
I think this episode is better than last week's.
All right. Well, improvement. I like to hear that. All right, well, folks, I think at this time I will exhort you all to hustle on, run to your computer chairs and jump on systemfailure.org. There you can read my weekly essays about this and a great many other riveting topics. You can enter your email address to receive those essays in your email inbox every week and never fear missing one. And furthermore, you can jump on and get in contact with Brian or me and let us know what you think of our ravings. Again, all that can be accomplished over at systemfailure.org.
All right.